Well, hello and welcome to the program. This is Daily Politics on Trust TV. I'm Abdullahi Ahmed. The Nigerian dream is no longer just about making it at home. It's about escaping to greener pastures. Across continents, Nigerians in the diaspora continue their unending quest for survival, navigating economic hardships, immigration hurdles, and the struggle to find dignity in foreign lands. Yet, back home, the very conditions that drive them away remain largely unaddressed. The Japa phenomenon has become more than just a trend. It is a desperate response to failing systems, a brain drain that robs Nigeria of its best talents. But is there a way to reverse this tide? And can Nigeria fix its broken system and create an environment where people no longer feel compelled to leave? Tonight, we examine the real cause of migration and the challenges Nigeria face abroad, as well as some homegrown solutions that make staying or even returning an attractive option. Joining me on the program tonight to unpack this development is investigative journalist and author David Hundeyin, who will be joining the conversation virtually. And I dare say he's someone who many would consider a Japarist by choice or circumstances. Mr. David Hundeyin, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Right. Help me situate this conversation, because we have been talking about this from several angles. The cost on Nigeria's economy, on the society's development, and also what it actually means for a country with so much promise. You recently had quite a lot to say about the situation where it appears that even those who are in search of this greener pasture appear to be chasing shadows sometimes, right? Because of the challenges they continue to face, moving from one country to the other. Help me understand the bigger picture here and what your message is about.
So, what I was trying to communicate was that even though obviously there's nothing wrong with emigrating, people emigrate all the time. It's not only Nigerians that move to other countries. Immigration is a global phenomenon. It's a human phenomenon. So there's nothing wrong with immigration. But my point was immigration must have a point. So when the Irish were doing their massive immigration to the so-called New World, which is now known as the US, they had a reason. It was an Irish potato famine, dying at home. They needed to make they needed an economic salvation somewhere else. So they moved down to Boston and other places on the eastern seaboard. They settled there finally. And then after settling, they then created economic links with the Irish homeland. So first of all, they weren't just running away. They were also trying to solve a problem back home by creating an economic base somewhere else first. And then, in addition to creating an economic base, which they used to assist to change the condition back home, they also created a community themselves where they were. So if you hear people say that they're Irish American, Irish in Boston, it's not just about. It's a very real community. They have communal institutions. They have community banks. They have all sorts of things that are set up to make it that they have an actual sort of mini country, if that makes sense. Now, when Nigerians immigrate, we don't see any of that. When Nigerians move to so-called economically developed society, what tends to happen is, sorry, let me adjust the voice.
Right.
Yeah. That's better. So when Nigerians emigrate, what they are not doing is building an economic base to sort of change the situation or the narrative back home. What they're doing is they're just escaping. And it's an escape that doesn't seem to have a defined endpoint or a defined conclusion. The example that I cited of this person I know is actually quite close to me, who started this extended process of escaping from Nigeria 25 years ago in the year 2000. I was still a primary school student then. So he left Nigeria, went to medical school in Ghana, worked in Ghana for some years, and then in 2017, with the wife and 2 children, moved to the UK. Then after 7 or 8 years in the UK, working as a doctor, as a GP, now he's moving to Australia again. And the reason is basically that, it's like this fear of missing out. Someone has told them that, there's more money now that is available for doctors in Australia. He's going to be there for a few years, And then it's going to hear, oh, there's a new opportunity in Canada or in Saudi Arabia or something, and they're going to rush again with, with wife and kids in tow. And for me, it's like, what is the purpose of what you are doing? Did you leave so that you could better your economic situation and then bring that wealth you have created for yourself back home to create or to improve something at home? Or are you just escaping for the sake of itself? Right? And then even where you are, even if you have no desire to benefit the people at home, even if you don't want to build anything at home, even where you are you building a Nigerian community there in the same way that other immigrant communities have built for themselves? And the answer is no. Nigerians do not do that. Instead, what they call Nigerian communities abroad are basically social clubs where Nigerians who live abroad go and basically compete socially with each other over who has the better job, who has the bigger house, who has the faster car. These are not the hallmarks of a progressive community or a progressive society. And I feel like these are conversations that need to be had. Because again, there's nothing wrong with immigration, but immigration must have a purpose and it must have a defined conclusion and a defined end point. Currently, I don't think we have a defined end point. Everyone just thinks that once you immigrate, somehow all your dreams are going to come true. And then when obviously they immigrate and those dreams are not coming true, they don't sit down and call themselves back and say, okay, I've been out of the country 10, 15, 20 years. What am I doing with my life? Where am I going? What do I want to do? It's just, no, I've escaped Nigeria. And once I've escaped Nigeria, that's the end. Even if I die in the process of being where I am without necessarily accomplishing anything, as long as it didn't happen in Nigeria, then somehow that makes it better. And I very strongly disagree with that notion that the country you were born in is a prison that you have to escape from. I think it's a lot more than that.
Right. Okay. And some would argue, David, that that's not the whole picture. Because right now we have some very outstanding members of the Nigerian community doing some very fantastic things in the public and private sector, in medicine, in technology, and a variety of things. I mean, the conservative leader in the United Kingdom is a British Nigerian, and we have some outstanding members of the Nigerian community in the US Army, in the legislature, across different parts of the world. So what does a complete picture look like if we have to situate the good versus the bad?
Right. So all these things that you listed, those are individual accomplishments. And obviously, Nigerians are as good as anyone else, or even better when it comes to accomplishing things individually. But when we're having this conversation, we're talking about a group phenomenon, right? So we say conservative, it's probably more, but we say conservatively that Nigeria has at least 2 million known people in the diaspora. It's probably multiples of that. But conservatively, we say 2 million Nigerians live in the so-called developed world. Okay, so what are those 2 million people accomplishing as a group, even in the developed world? Because what other groups do when they have those kind of numbers and they control significant amounts of wealth due to their individual accomplishments is that they create institutions and organizations that, first of all, ring-fence them in that place. So in the Indian communities in the UK or in Australia or in the US, in addition to just being wealthy and having money and being individually successful, they have political action groups. They have lobbies that work for them, which is how come you have a situation where you are able to have people from those backgrounds who make it to the very top of the political echelon in those societies. We've had a UK Prime Minister who came from an Indian background. So far, that has never happened from a Nigerian perspective in any of the societies that Nigerians live in their numbers or come close. The closest that has come to happening so far is, as you mentioned, the current UK Conservative leader. But even within that, you can see that there's a very, very marked difference in the way that she did it or is doing it and the way that other people have done it. Because she has done it by building an entire platform out of consistently and constantly taking unnecessary shots at Nigeria. Right? Her entire political platform is built on, please, white people, vote for me if you don't want your country to look like the country that I escaped from. Right? So this political platform is not built on sort of bringing someone from a Nigerian background into the mainstream and sort of integrating that community into the British mainstream. It's about marginalizing them further and saying, hey, hate all of them, but exclude me because I'm the special one. That doesn't help anyone in the long run, not even her, right? So when I say that these things are not being done the right way, or that the things we hope that we're accomplishing are not being accomplished, what I mean is that as a collective, the things that the Nigerian diaspora should be doing are, one, we should be exerting a lot more political influence back home than it's currently doing. It currently has zero political influence in Nigeria. Two, as an economic or financial bloc, it should be exerting a lot of economic influence back home. There should be a bank in Nigeria that should be backed by the strength of the economic strength of the Nigerian diaspora, which is much bigger than most of the economic strength that is available in Nigeria. And yet, what do you see? There is no such thing. There are no institutions. There's nothing that is diaspora backed in Nigeria, despite Nigeria having by far the wealthiest diaspora in the whole of Africa. There is no. So when you compare that to a country like Somalia, for example, I know we shouldn't use a country like Somalia as an example, but we're constrained for examples. Somalia is a country which, as poor and as destabilized as it is, I think something like half of the current parliament of Somalia is foreign born. So if you go to the equivalent of the House of Representatives and you listen to them talk, you hear British accents, you hear American accents, you hear Australian accents. The entire Somalian diaspora basically came back together after the collapse of the country's government and basically constituted themselves into some form of a government, right? They basically are what is holding that country together. The Nigerian diaspora has no such dream of someday returning and exerting power or influence in Nigeria. The Nigerian diaspora dream is, once I've escaped Nigeria and I manage to find an economically rewarding hustle somewhere, then I'm going to buy a car, I'm going to rent or build a house, I'm going to have a wife and kids, and I'm going to take pictures for Instagram and occasionally send $50 or $100 back home. And that's it. I think that's a very small dream. I think that's a very tiny dream. I think with all the opportunities that the world offers and that the Nigerian diaspora has access to, I think it's tragic that our imagination is so limited.
Right. So, David, let's consider the commission that has been saddled with the responsibility of harmonizing and coming up with a strategy to address the structural issues that you're talking about. Something that looks like a coordinated attempt to organize the Nigerian community in the diaspora. Talk to me about what you make of the contributions of the Nigeria in Diaspora Commission and some of its efforts to streamline not just the activities of the government in collaboration with the diasporan community, but also to harmonize some sort of activity across, especially some of these countries where you have a significant number of Nigerians residing in.
I will choose my words very carefully here. I think the Nigerians in Diaspora Commission is a government institution, and because it's a government institution, I think there's a limit to the role that it can play in this scenario that I'm talking about. So even though, as you rightly said, there has been some sort of, at least on paper, there has been some sort of an attempt now and again for NIDCOM to sort of midwife some of these things I'm talking about. The fact of the matter is, most or the vast majority of Nigerians who live in the diaspora left primarily due to either economic displacement, they're either economic refugees, or there was some other factor which is basically down to government failure that drove them into the diaspora. So those people very, very understandably have a very limited amount of trust for the Nigerian government. So to now expect them to work with a Nigerian government parastatal in putting these things together is very optimistic at best. I don't really think it's going to happen. So I think the main responsibility for making these things happen actually lies with ordinary members of the diaspora themselves. Private diaspora organizations, I believe, are the ones who need to push this, because that's how it has been done elsewhere. Even in countries that have much more state capacity than Nigeria, that have gone through similar phases where the diaspora had to sort of play a role in holding things together. It was often the case, or it was almost uniformly the case, that the um, the input of the states into those diaspora organizations is very limited. It's the people themselves. Right, sorry, I got some feedback. It's the people themselves who need to sort of take the driving seat and sort of take the lead, dictate the narrative almost, because they are the ones who know where the shoe pinches, and they are the ones who are the least likely to either get corrupted or distracted or whatever. Because I guess the advantage that private diaspora organizations have over state-led initiatives in the Nigerian context is that they have the best of both worlds. So they have the insight of the lived experience and being Nigerians and having access to Nigerian passports and whatnot. But they also have the economic privilege that enables them to get things done without the, I'm not saying that they're saints or that, diasporas are not corrupt people. That's not true. But it's just the likelihood or probability of these leakages and inefficiencies is lessened because the economic pressures that increase the risk of leakage and corruption are just not there, at least for the most part. So I think it's up to the diasporas themselves to push these things. I don't think a responsible diaspora will say, well, if NIPCOM can't do this or if NIPCOM isn't doing this, then we don't have it. I don't think that's it at all. Nigeria doesn't belong to NIPCOM. Nigeria belongs to Nigerian citizens, to Nigerian people. So, yeah.
Right. Okay. I suppose that NIPCOM would say it's still a work in progress. But talk to me about what's happening on the global stage, because we're seeing this global anti-migration sentiment that is being used as a political rhetoric to win elections, not just in the United States of America, but in Europe also. The anti-migration sentiment in Germany, the same thing in Italy, the same thing in the UK, which you alluded to how Kemi Badenoch, for instance, is using that to gain some sort of popularity within the Conservative Party. Talk to me about how that is going to impact this whole Japa phenomenon, because most of the people of Nigerian descent who are either in the UK or in the US or in Canada or in Australia or in some of these other countries have to consider the option of coming back home should these governments double down on, say for instance, cutting down the number of immigrants they decide to allow in their countries.
So people really don't like to hear this, even though I think it's visible to the blind and audible to the deaf. Let me start by using an anecdote, which is from 2 or 3 days ago. So it emerged 2 or 3 days ago. If you recall, recently the US government deported a whole bunch of immigrants to one of the world's most notorious supermax prisons in El Salvador, claiming that they are Venezuelan criminals. Now it has emerged that at least one of these supposed Venezuelan criminals is actually a US citizen and is a nail technician. He's not a criminal. And the official word from the US government is that, okay, we've identified that we wrongfully deported someone who is actually a US citizen and who is not Venezuelan or from El Salvador, has no business there. But it's been done, and we can't get him out. So basically what that means is that a completely innocent person who just happens to be phenotypically Hispanic and was identified by the immigration and customs enforcement officials as foreign looking or someone who looks like an immigrant, was arrested illegally, profiled as an immigrant even though he's not, he's a US citizen, was bundled into detention, bundled onto a deportation flight, deported to a country he has never been to, and then locked up inside a supermax prison in that country with some of the world's most notorious criminals. And the US government says, we can't do anything about it. It's done, it's done. So yeah, I guess you're just going to have to stay locked up in that prison. Why I decided to mention these anecdotes is that I think it's very obvious that not just in the US, but across the entire Western world, there is a very clear move toward not just restricting the number of visas that are being given out and the number of immigrants coming in, but to actually purge those societies of a large part of what they consider to be their immigrant population. As I said, what they consider to be their immigrant population, because you might say that, oh, I'm not an immigrant, I'm a citizen I have the passport, or I was even born here. I've never, so I don't come from anywhere else. I come from here. But the reality is, if you are not white, if you are not phenotypically Anglo-Saxon, Caucasian, you will be profiled as an immigrant, even if you in fact did not immigrate, even if you were born there. This is already happening. So, what I think a lot of the Nigerian diaspora needs to understand is that, contrary to a lot of the cultural programming that we pump into our own heads as Nigerians, that narrative that somehow we're special, or the amount of good work that we do, the achievements that we have, the income that we control, the bank size of our bank accounts, the jobs and the titles and the education and whatnot, that somehow makes us some sort of model minority, model immigrants. That such concepts fly out of the window where political normalcy ends. And political normalcy is not just ending, has already ended in some instances, right? Because these are, when you start seeing stories like this, these are Western governments testing the waters to see how people react. And so far, there has been no reaction whatsoever, which means they're going to do it again, but it's going to be at a larger scale. And almost inevitably, we know that when these things tend to happen, we know who are the people who are always close to the front of the line. It's black people. And we are the blackest of black people, and also the loudest of black people. We are going to be there. So what a lot of Nigerian diaspora needs to accept, as much as they don't want to hear it, is, sorry?
Yeah, go ahead. I think we lost you for a second there, but go ahead, please.
Right. So I'm saying, what I think the Nigerian diaspora needs to hear, even though they really don't want to hear it, is that this is the time to be. I'm not even saying you have to pack everything you have and move back to Nigeria, sell your house and go and move to Lagos and move to Kano. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is, now is the time to start building those economic links back home that you didn't do all this time. Because as I said, this diaspora is unique for how disconnected it is. The only connection that a lot of this diaspora has with Nigeria is that people send money home, or once a year people visit home. But in terms of actual economic linkages, like how the Indians have done it, where their entire swathes of the US tech industry that is basically held up by parts of Bangalore, what's it called, the business outsourcing market in Bangalore has been very, very cleverly interwoven with the US economy in ways that make it almost intrinsic. So the Nigerian diaspora hasn't done that. This is the time to start creating economic linkages back home and making this, creating the circumstances for you to have something to return to, so that in the event that these things happen, you don't end up just losing on both sides. Why I'm very, very particular about this is that I realize that a lot of this diaspora is very, very unaware of Western history. And when I say Western history, I'm not talking about from the 1700s. I'm talking about from the last century, the 20th and 21st century. These things have been happening. A lot of this diaspora doesn't know, for example, that there have been several times in US history over the last century where US citizens, people who are US citizens, who have been profiled as either threats or foreign born or immigrants or whatnot, have been deported in large numbers. So during the Second World War, for example, a lot of the Nigerian diaspora in the US does not know that the entire population of Japanese Americans, that's Japanese people people of Japanese descent who were born in America, who are American citizens, this entire population, they were rounded up and put in concentration camps, in internment camps. This is a thing. And after the war, they were paid reparations. A lot of this is completely unknown to this diaspora population. There are similar things have been done to, for example, Mexican Americans. There have been several times when large populations of Americans of Mexican descent have been deported. These are American citizens, and they were deported to Mexico, a country they've never been to. And there's been a lot of back and forth about this. We're not special. It's going to happen to us, and it's not just going to happen in the US. It's going to happen in the UK. It's going to happen in Germany. It's going to happen in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, all those places that we go to. The legal precedent has already been set, and things are moving unmistakably in that direction. So this is the time for Nigeria's diaspora to be looking homeward, and to be trying to build one or two structures, economic and physical, back home to ensure that they have something to return to. This is not the time to be, trying to become a bigger person in that part of the world than you currently are. This is not the time to be buying houses in the West. This is not the time at all. This is the time to be liquidating your assets and trying to send money to, trusted institutions back home that can hold your wealth, because there's going to come a time. I'll just quickly close with this. You might not be aware of this. The German government very quietly pushed something through last year. Most people are unaware of it. They've actually put limits on how much, as an immigrant, you can actually send home. Because they have realized that a lot of you are just coming here they are economic refugees, and you are basically working and sending money home to sustain your families. And they feel like that money is leaving our economy, and that money shouldn't leave our economy. They have actually introduced legislation to limit how much you can send them. So if you wait until those deportation flights start taking off, and then you try and liquidate your 100 or 200,000 euros worth of assets that you have so that you can run, you'll just find out at that point you're not allowed to live with it, and you have to leave the country. Right. So basically, the same way you left Nigeria with nothing, this is the way you will return with nothing. So this is the time to start making those intelligent moves like other people are doing, and you don't have to wait until the police start knocking at your door.
Right. Obviously, that would be the worst case scenario for anyone who Japa willingly trying to make a better life for themselves and their families. But talk to me about what the trend is showing, for instance, because the traffic seems to be one way. People leaving Nigeria in search of greener pastures wherever, including Libya, one of the most unstable countries on the continent, right? Talk to me about whether you're seeing a shift in this trend with all of the experiences. Some of them have been on social media complaining about the realities in wherever the host countries may be in Europe or in America, for instance, and sometimes these stories are quite disturbing, to say the least. Do you think there's enough that is happening to suggest that the tide is turning, where what you're talking to, this return back home, is likely going to happen?
So the voluntary return back home is definitely not happening yet, because as you rightly said, people are still finding themselves in all sorts of funny places that they really have no business being in, because they still believe very erroneously that absolutely anywhere is better than Nigeria. And a large part of the reason why there is that continued misconception is that I believe, it's very difficult to prove these things, but I believe that there is a very clever, how do I put it, social engineering or information campaign being waged to implant that idea into the minds of Nigerians or Africans, that all your hopes and dreams lie on the other side of the water, that there's absolutely nothing for you in Africa. Africa is dead. And that if you want to do absolutely anything worthwhile with your life, you have to run away. Because, Africa is just this giant open air prison, right? There's this social conditioning that has relentlessly drummed that message into the heads of Nigerians and Africans for years, maybe for decades. So even now, where I think those who have a global perspective can see that globally the tides are shifting, globally the geopolitical scenario is moving in a direction where it's very unwise for you to even be trying to move to the Western world now. But our people back home haven't got the memo at all. They really don't know, right? Because the message is still being pumped into their head till now as we speak, is that once you somehow, one way or the other, set foot in Europe or in North America or whatever, in 6 months your life is going to be different. All the things you couldn't accomplish in Nigeria, you're going to accomplish it there, which is false. But that message is being relentlessly drummed in somehow. So I think, I don't like recommending that the Nigerian government should or should not do that, because chances are it's not going to happen. But if I were the Nigerian government, I would, maybe it's a national orientation agency. I'm not sure exactly who is responsible for this, but I will be looking at where is this messaging coming from, and how can this messaging be um, basically stymied from source, right? Because this is very dangerous messaging that is being pumped. I would even argue that it's a threat to national security, where external actors are going into Africa's largest population, and which is also one of the youngest populations in the world, right? And telling the young people in that population that instead of looking for a way to succeed where they are, instead of getting involved in any sort of activity where they are, the one and only thing they should be trying to do is escaping, is getting out. I think that there's an argument actually that maybe the National Intelligence Agency, or the Defense Intelligence Agency, should be interested in where are these messages coming from, who has a motive or who benefits from pushing such a message into African heads. I say this because a few weeks ago, I had actually had a conversation like this. It was actually regarding Ghana, but the situation is kind of similar. Where I recall there was the EU mission in Ghana invited a whole bunch of Ghanaian social media influencers, video content creators, skit makers, whatnot, to their mission, wined and dined them, and then afterwards tasked them to start putting up these messages on social media. And I was looking at these messages that these young people were putting up. These are very young people. The oldest one maybe is 27, right? Most of them are between the ages of 20 and 27, right? So these are young people who have hundreds of thousands of followers and eyeballs, right? And the messages that they're putting up, and these messages come with like EU branding, the logo and everything, and they were saying things like, if I hadn't left Ghana, I wouldn't have been able to do such and such and such. And I'm thinking to myself, why is a foreign embassy coming to sub-Saharan Africa and paying sub-Saharan African influencers to tell their audience of young people like them in that country that their hopes and dreams lie somewhere in Europe? Why are you doing that? And I don't think it's that blatant in Nigeria, but I believe something similar is happening in Nigeria, where young people are being convinced against all evidence that somehow crossing the Sahara Desert in this day and age is still a good idea, and that somehow it's possible in this day and age to make it from Libya to Europe, even though you are much more likely to end up being kidnapped and raped and sold as a slave and dying in the process of doing that. So I think there's an unseen hand somewhere that is responsible for still pushing our people into this cursed journey that they still insist on embarking on. And I think we need to find out who that person is, and that messaging needs to be stopped. Young Nigerians need to be given a very clear understanding, a very clear picture of what the world actually is. That there is no paradise anywhere. There is nowhere where you will go and all your hopes and dreams will come true. There is nowhere you will go where everything is waiting for you on a platter. It doesn't exist. And that even if you do want to emigrate, at the very least, you have to do things the right and the legal way. And if you try 2-3 times it's not working, then accept that immigration isn't going to be for everybody. 200 million people cannot emigrate. That has never happened in the history of the world. So accept it and try and find success wherever you are.
Right. So, I mean, obviously that is something of a food of a thought for a lot of people listening to the conversation right now. But we did earlier on talk about the push and pull factor. The escapism that you say has made it easy for so many Nigerians to take this perilous journey sometimes, or perhaps risk everything, sell their homes, their businesses, and whatever they have here to try to make a new life elsewhere. Let's talk about what's happening back home and how that is contributing to this exodus of professionals. What do you think about it? I mean, we've had so many professional bodies, for instance, in the healthcare industry, warning about some of these shortages because Nigerian doctors and nurses are being sought after in different parts of the world, for instance. And the government appears to say, well, you know what, we can afford more. We can afford to train more. We can afford to have more to replace them. What do you make of what's happening back home that is serving as a push factor to, incentivize the urge to search for these greener pastures elsewhere?
Well, first of all, the government isn't being honest when they say, well, there's this everlasting conveyor belt of talent coming through, so we can always train more. That's not true. Because first of all, are they training more? What's the budget for education? I was curious enough to run this recently through, I believe it was the CIA World Factbook. Out of 197 countries that are ranked, Nigeria is 196 out of 197 in terms of the percentage of its GDP that is spent on education. Nigeria spends about 0.7% of GDP on education. That's the second lowest in the world. The only country lower than Nigeria is Somalia, right? So with the exception of Somalia, every other African country spends more on education as a percentage of its GDP than Nigeria. So are they training more? Are they really? And then when you also take into account that funding for universities, for example, has been slashed for the last 2 years, and then we're seeing things like student loans being used as stopgap measures to address that funding shortfall. The funding already wasn't anything close to what was needed, but even that funding is not being sustained. And then we're saying we're training more. It's not true. So what is inevitably going to happen is that those shortages are going to become very, very apparent. They're going to worsen because the doctors and nurses it's not just doctors and nurses, even radiologists, X-ray technicians, all sorts of medical specialists. They're all living in Nigeria, and the reason they're leaving is because it's relatively easy for them to do so because all they have to do is write an exam, which is doable, and there are several jurisdictions where they are in demand, right? Even in the UK, which is currently experiencing a bit of a downturn, they're still somewhat in demand. And that's not to talk of places like Australia and Saudi Arabia. There is plenty of demand there. So they will keep leaving because the demand outside Nigeria exists. And some of those richer countries outside of Nigeria, they have this, you would have to say it's quite a colonial mindset that they have where they see it as cheap labor. So they are the ones who have to invest in training doctors and nurses because it's very expensive to train doctors and nurses. So they will have to invest in that. So they'll wait until some poor country like Nigeria does it, and then they just go and take their pick of the best talents. And that's how they've been doing it. But obviously there's nothing we can do about that. But what we can do is that push factor. And that push factor is, first of all, it's not just the fact that the payment is poor, the salaries are relatively lower in Nigeria. It might also surprise you to know that doctors and nurses a lot of the time in Nigeria can't even find a job. As surprising as that might be. And I know this because I come from a family full of doctors. I've been surrounded by doctors all of my life. And you realize that when they come out of medical school and maybe they do their house job, for them to actually get to like a full-time salary position, it takes them years. And that's in Nigeria where there's such a huge shortage, supposedly. And the reason for that is that the government, which is obviously the largest employer of medical professionals in Nigeria, isn't investing enough to keep up with the demand for medical professionals. So on paper, I think Nigeria has the correct ratio is supposed to be something like one doctor, I think, to 1,500 or something. And I think Nigeria is doing like maybe one doctor to like 6,000. So on paper, there's a huge shortfall. But in terms of actual available, fillable positions, they're actually not that many. So Nigeria has this shortfall of medical professionals, but there's also a market glut at the same time, which makes no sense. So obviously, they are going to keep finding their way out. The only solution for this situation is for the government to start investing more money. The private sector cannot fill in for the government. This is one of those areas where it's like education. You can't outsource it to the private sector. It has to be the government. Otherwise, there's no point having a government. The government exists primarily for defense, for providing a justice system, and then for providing services like education and healthcare. That's the backbone of a government. So if a government isn't providing those things, then it really has no right to exist. So I don't know how the Nigerian government with its current balance sheet wants to fix that problem, but that's a problem that has to be fixed. There's a lot of investment that needs to go into healthcare and education, especially healthcare. It just has to happen. There needs to be more hospitals built. There needs to be more vacancies for doctors and nurses made available. And as much as they don't want to hear this, the pay scales, which haven't been updated for a number of years, also need to be revised. Because if those pay scales are revised, even just 30% upwards, what you will then see is that there will be a vast reduction in the number of people who want to, even though the big money is still available elsewhere, if things can be made just a little bit easier where they are, nobody really just wants to up and completely upset their lives and just move to a new continent and start all over again at age 32. Nobody really wants to do that. So
Right.
the government needs to basically invest more money. I don't know where they're going to find that money from, and it's not my job to tell them where to find the money from,
Right.
but they're going to need to invest more.
Okay, earlier on, you drew comparisons with Irish Americans, for instance, or the Irish community when they migrated, how closely knitted they remained, and how they built a whole community for themselves. You talked about the Indians, their impact and influence in Silicon Valley, what they're able to do in the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. Let's draw parallels and perhaps identify some of the distinctions there and what the Nigerian communities in diaspora can do to perhaps bring about an upward trajectory that suggests that they're not just there as individuals or as a social club, but as a community that can thrive and help those back at home, benefit from some of the progresses that they're recording elsewhere.
So I think the most important thing that they can do is get involved in the politics of Nigeria. Currently, Nigerian politics is dominated by a very tiny cabal, which, I mean, it's basically those who have access to capital in Nigeria that have access to the levers of politics in Nigeria. The vast majority of Nigeria's population, obviously, I believe, lives under less than $4 or $5 a day, or it used to be that actually. We are approaching $2 or $3 a day now. More than 100 million Nigerians live in multi-dimensional poverty. So these are not the people who can find their way into politics. These are not people who can fund a political takeover in Nigeria. The Nigerians that have that economic capacity almost entirely live in the diaspora. Now, we saw in 2023, the diaspora made some sort of an attempt to get involved in Nigerian politics. They held fundraisers for specific candidates. Some candidates traveled to many diaspora locations. They held town hall meetings, and all that is well and good. But that is still a sort of Nigerian politician that is merely trying to solicit support from a diaspora provision. Now, when I say the diaspora needs to get involved in Nigerian politics, I mean the Nigerian diaspora itself needs to execute something like, pardon me for using this term, a political coup in Nigeria, where using the economic resources and obviously access to Nigeria that they have, they can carry out this sort of insurgent political takeover in a way that ordinary Nigerians in Nigeria really cannot, because they just don't have the resources. I don't really want to go into like too much detail, because I feel like maybe that would be like sort of giving the game away if such a thing exists. But I feel like presently that is not being done. Nigerian diaspora is just happy to sort of engage very, very passively with Nigeria, and then every 3 or 4 years, when there's an election, then they make noise about, oh, why do we have diaspora voting? And then maybe some of them go home to vote. Some of them send money home to contribute to certain candidates, and they think they've done their bit.
Right.
They feel like the majority of the responsibility for engaging in Nigeria's politics lies with Nigerians in Nigeria. I would argue that Nigerians outside Nigeria have an even bigger role to play, because they are the ones who have a level of economic freedom that Nigerians in Nigeria don't have. Right? But they don't want to take on that responsibility. They feel like, oh, we've escaped Nigeria. We send $100 home every month. What else do you want from us? Right. I feel like that's a mistaken state of mind. And then the second thing that I feel like they're not doing is what the Indians do, where, as I said, so I believe it's the third or fourth largest city in India. It's called Bangalore. It's a tech hub in India. And basically, what is the primary business model of Bangalore? It's business process outsourcing. It's basically, to put it in very crude terms, it's a very big call center. And it's basically doing call center work for pretty much the entire world tech industry. And how that came to be was that Indians in the American diaspora, in the European diaspora, and the Australian diaspora discovered that this upcoming tech industry, when the software tech industry was becoming a thing in the 80s and 90s, that it requires a lot of work that is kind of skilled, but at the same time very repetitive and labor intensive. The type of work that the governments in those societies were trying to transition away from, because they consider themselves to be service economies, and they felt like, we can tap into this, right? That if there's a sufficient standard of education in India, then we can link this huge market opportunity to this huge opportunity in India. The trade-off, obviously, is that the wages they're going to be paying to the Indians will be significantly less than what they would pay in America. But on the other hand, even if you're paid a fraction of what they're paying there, that fraction is still more than what those people would have earned anyway, right? And they basically created this whole industry from scratch. It was diaspora Indians that did that. Now, maybe the business processing outsourcing opportunity has been sold up by the Indians, but I think there are other opportunities that Nigeria's population. The primary economic value that Nigeria offers to the world is not crude oil, it's not solid minerals, it's not things under the soil. The primary economic opportunity offered by Nigeria is the fact that there are 200 million young people who are, for the most part, English speakers, and who are, to a large extent, literate. That's a huge economic opportunity, and I feel like Nigerian diaspora has the ability to link that opportunity to another opportunity that exists somewhere in the world where they are. But they are not willing to do that because they fundamentally don't see themselves as people who have any connection to or responsibility to where they're coming from. They rather see themselves as people who have transitioned beyond being Nigerian because they now have a blue passport, they now have a red passport, and somehow that sets them apart. So apart from sending a few $100s home now and again, they don't really want to, they don't really see themselves in that way, which is a mistake that other immigrant populations have never made. Other immigrant populations understand that you can be an American citizen, you can be a British, German, French citizen, but you are still where you're from. You're still from where you're from. That never changes. Nigerians, for whatever reason, don't really get that. And Africans as well, it's not just Nigerians, I have to say. A lot of Africans have had this same issue where they feel like they are Canadian, or they are American, or they are British, which is nonsense, right? You are a Canadian citizen, but you are not Canadian. You are a British citizen, but you're not British, right? There are indigenous or people who have been there for hundreds of years. The people whose ancestors, you can trace their ancestry back 1,000 years in the UK. And then you arrived in 2019, and you think because you have a document that says you're a UK citizen, that makes you the same as someone whose ancestors moved from Normandy in 1061 to Southampton. No, it does not. So those two things, funding a political takeover in Nigeria so that they can secure themselves in Nigeria if and when they were to return home, number one. Secondly, building economic links between both sides of the water. They're not doing that. And then I think the third thing they're also not doing, in my opinion, this is probably the most painful one, although it's not, you might disagree, is that their children or their descendants are not being raised to think of themselves as people who have a connection with the place that their parents came from, or to think of themselves as Nigerian. You will notice this is an anecdote that you might consider it to be an insignificant anecdote, but it's something that I noted when I saw it. A few months ago, I was watching an English Premier League extra. So it was a program talking about the lives of English Premier League players, and there was a segment in the program where foreign players in the league, they lined up about 30 of them and asked them, what's the pronunciation of your name? So the players from Serbia or Finland or whatever, everyone was pronouncing their names, and then they got to the players who were like British born but are like Nigerians. So they had names like Noni Madueke or Elijah Adebayo, those kinds of names. And you were hearing these kids couldn't pronounce their own names properly.
Right.
Because clearly their parents had never taught them to pronounce their own names properly. I'm not even talking about speaking the language just pronounce your own name properly. They couldn't.
Right.
So someone whose name is Noni Madueke, he couldn't pronounce it. He says Noni Madueke, you
Right.
know.
Right.
So clearly there's been a huge failure of parenting there. And that's something I've noticed across the Nigerian diaspora, where parents are very proud for their children to have an Australian accent, British accent, American accent, which is fine. But it's possible for them to have those things and also maintain their identity, which again is a mistake that the other diaspora populations did not make.
Right.
You know, I've been with third or fourth generation Indian immigrants in the UK. Their parents have lived in the UK since the 40s, or grandparents, and they speak Hindi.
Okay.
Some of them have never even been to India before. They speak Hindi. They celebrate, what's it called, Diwali and all of these things. They consider themselves to be culturally Indian, and they're British people who have lived for 3 or 4 generations in that country. Why can't Nigerians do that?
Okay. That is a great point, David, to end this conversation. I think that for the most part, you get a sense that there could be a whole lost generation whose identity is somewhere in between Nigeria and wherever their home country might be. And that is definitely a cautionary tale for all to heed. David Hundeyin, as always, fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on Daily Politics. We really do appreciate you for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Right. And of course, that's our show for you tonight. Thank you most kindly for joining us. We will be back over the next edition will be coming your way on Friday. So feel free to be a part of it. Until next time, I'm Abdullahi Ahmed. Thank you for your time and good evening.